this is a topic that really is kind of more broadly, in my mind, under the field of customer experience or CX, but I think has a lot of implications for folks who are doing UX research and design work as well. And so I think it's a area that really all organizations should consider to think about how they're gathering feedback from their customers. Or in the case of some organizations, it might be customers, it might be members, it might, in the case of governments, be citizens, whoever your constituents are. I do want to take a minute too, just to note that when I presented at the IA conference, I actually co-presented this with my colleague named Vrenda Gupta. And so I didn't want to take all the credit for the content you'll see in this presentation. She did help me develop a lot of this content. And even though she's not co-presenting tonight with me, she's here in spirit. So I just wanted to give her that nod. So we're going to talk a little bit about what voice of the customer is and why it's important, and then how you can actually get started with starting your own voice of the customer program in your organization, and what that looks like from piloting initially to scaling up to a fully mature voice of the customer program over time. So what is VOC, as we call it, and why is it important? So voice of the customer is really, as I see it, the cornerstone of a great customer experience. It's really about getting feedback at each stage in a customer's journey. Both quantitative and qualitative feedback. So it could be feedback that's gathered through a lot of different mechanisms. Surveys are certainly probably the most common, but it's having a formal program around how you collect customer feedback and then how you use it to improve the customer experience. And that includes how you use it to improve the user experience as it relates to their interactions with apps and websites and all of the other kind of human to computer processes that they interact with when they have a journey with your company as a member or as a customer. So you've probably seen voice of the customer in action somewhere before. Anytime that you get a quick survey after you've done a transaction with a company or interacted with a customer service representative, when you get those little surveys, those are examples of VOC in action. Companies who have a really mature VOC model are actually taking this information at each stage in the customer journey and integrating it into kind of a larger systematic approach to tracking the customer experience over time. So, and we'll talk more about the maturity levels, but it's really about going away from just one survey that's siloed in one department of a company to making sure that all of the touch points that you have with a customer over time are measured in terms of their experience, and that information is not siloed across the organization, but that it's actually free and open, and that everybody in the organization has access to that information to help improve whatever aspect it is that they deliver to the customer. And so there's a lot of information there that could be really important to informing how we design systems for our customers, and that helps us have some empathy and understanding of and context around what they're thinking and feeling when they're interacting with our company at different stages in the customer journey. So they may have different emotions at different points in the journey, different expectations from the brand that they have at different points of interacting with systems. And so those expectations aren't the same at the beginning of a journey, perhaps, as they are at the end of a journey. And we have to think about, what does that mean for how we design systems? So why is voice of the customer becoming more and more important to folks who work in CX, UX, content strategy, digital performance optimization, and those types of fields? It's becoming more important really because companies are starting to see that customer experience is really the basis of everything that they do. It's really what's impacting the bottom line the most. One Gartner study found that 89% of companies say that they're really competing now on the basis of the customer experience. And another piece of reporting from Forbes actually found that customers who do have a good experience, they're 3.5 times more likely to make additional purchases and 5 times more likely to recommend. Now, you can imagine over the course of a customer lifetime what that looks like, how that scales. If you start to have more and more customers who fall into that high value, more likely to recommend area, the folks who are having a good experience over time. So for the private sector, gathering that feedback so that you know exactly what to design, but you know how to improve designs, and you know how to improve touch points along the customer journey is really important to being profitable. In the public sector, customer experience and voice of the customer programs are actually becoming required. They're part of the law and part of policy. And so we've seen with the president's management agenda, as well as OMB Circular A11, we've seen a lot of policy come out in the federal government that has dictated that the citizen experience needs to be improved. And so we've seen a lot of activity around this in the last couple of years, where the General Services Administration has actually stood up centers of excellence, and one of those centers of excellence is a customer experience center of excellence, where they're actually sending teams into other government agencies to improve the experience in various ways, which I'll talk a little bit about a couple of those examples in a minute. And then with the passing of the 21st Century Integrated Digital Experience Act, or IDEA, we're also seeing now where there are actual laws being put into place and passed through Congress, where the customer experience or the citizen experience is becoming something that's important to government to improve. And so not only is it about delivering on the mission and cost savings for government agencies, but as they increase satisfaction and citizen experience, they're starting to now become compliant with some of the mandates and laws that have been put into place. And so government agencies are starting to now get measured on these things. For the nonprofit sector, I would say that the nonprofit sector is really lagging behind a little bit in terms of what we've seen in the private sector. You know, the private sector, as it typically does, has kind of led the way in voice of the customer programs. The public sector has gotten on board now, and with nonprofits, where we see that they really do have gathering feedback as a large priority, and they do gather a lot of feedback, a lot of data, but they aren't really sure what to do with it. Only 13% of them, according to a study that HubSpot actually ran, uh, are using that feedback for any way to improve their services. And so there's a lot of room for growth in that sector to work with nonprofits as well, to help them say, okay, you now have all of this great feedback from your members, but what is it you're going to do with it? How do you action plan around it? So we're going to talk a little bit about some of that as well. So I really see the importance of VOC to UX researchers and designers and architects as giving us a more holistic understanding of the overall experience that people have with our organizations. I think sometimes we tend to get really focused on whatever product we're building at the time, right? And so we do our due diligence and we advocate for users, and we do a lot of user research. We do a lot of testing of our prototypes before we deploy things. And so we really feel like we've done a good job of representing the user, but we sometimes do that in a vacuum, kind of ignorant of what's going on in the rest of the organization, and where the people we're designing for are in their customer journey. And so by having VOC data and having a program to collect that customer feedback along the way at many different touch points in their journey, we really start to get a better understanding and more context for our designs. And so then we're not just designing for one moment, but we're designing potentially for multiple moments and contexts across the customer base. So to me, it just gives us a lot more vectors of feedback and research data that we can use to inform our designs, instead of just being limited to what we get out of one user research effort or one usability study. We're actually developing a systematic process by which we collect feedback from users all the time, continuously. So what this helps us do, I mentioned that it helps us as UXers really uh, make sure that we're designing the right things for the right people at the right time. And so there was this really interesting project that we worked on at ICF Next, which is the company that I work for as the strategy lead in our experience practice. And this was with the USDA as part of one of those CX centers of excellence that I mentioned. And they actually brought us in because they thought that the digital loan application that farmers use online to apply for a farm loan needed a lot of improvement. They were seeing that farmers were really struggling with the loan process. And so we actually came in and we started to institute some of the principles of voice of the customer programs, and we decided that we needed to collect more feedback from more vectors. And we actually went out into the field to talk to farmers. We actually went out and we did card sorts on the back of the tailgates of their trucks. And we went and met with people out on farms, and we talked to them face to face. And what we learned through that process was that the farmers didn't actually need the digital loan application updated. It was a lot of the face-to-face interactions that they were having with their local loan officers that were causing them pain points. And as we investigated that more and more, we learned that the loan officers themselves really didn't have the tools that they needed to be able to serve farmers. It wasn't the loan application as everybody once thought. It was actually some of the tools that the loan officers were using that were kind of broken, tools that they needed that they didn't have that were causing friction when they actually met with farmers. And so what we learned by collecting more feedback from customers just outside of the web analytics and things that we had about the digital loan application was we were able to actually solve the right problem. And instead of spending a bunch of time and money redesigning something that was actually kind of okay to begin with. So in this way, you can see, I think, how voice of the customer inputs become design outputs for UX, but they also can become design outputs for marketing plans and for product strategy and a lot of other things. And I think that's one of the appeals of voice of the customer is that it's really useful for the entire organization in a lot of different ways. It's especially useful to UX, but it's a program that can be used to kind of improve the customer experience across the organization. And so we can gather that feedback through a lot of mechanisms that you would probably guess: surveys, in-depth interviews. We can look at analytics to some extent, even through social media listening tools. A lot of times we can gather information about what customers are experiencing and use that also as a voice of the customer feedback mechanism. And so when we synthesize all of that, what we get out of it is really service design, where we're improving processes, we're putting the right people on the right problems. And to me, a lot of it's really about breaking down the silos of information. I work with some pretty large, not only federal government organizations, but with some Fortune 500 healthcare companies and things like that. And I think often what we see is that one department will have done this really great research study and have some great data on a population and their experience, and we'll start working with another department and we won't find out until halfway through the process that somebody had already done some really valuable research. And so by having a formalized voice of the customer program, you start to get the whole organization on board, develop a kind of a common set of core knowledge and data around customer feedback that can be accessed by all departments at any time within the context of where they touch the customer along that journey. So now that we've talked a little bit about what the heck is VOC and why can it be really useful and important for organizations, we're going to jump into how do you get started with this? Where if you've never done it before, if your organization really doesn't have a lot of feedback mechanisms in place, how can you start? So the first thing that you've got to do is take an inventory of where you are today. And so this is pretty easy. So you just want to identify the existing methods of customer feedback that you have. And so this involves some stakeholder interviews typically, and you would go around the organization talking to people who might have this kind of data and start to really develop an inventory. Literally, it could be a spreadsheet of just all of the places where the organization's gathering feedback, what types of questions they're asking, where in the customer journey, is it pre-sale, is it at sale, after sale, and of course you can adapt that context to not just organizations who sell things, right, but also for governmental and other organizations. But what are the touch points where feedback is collected or currently isn't collected? So having a picture of that inventory and where it maps to the member or customer or citizen journey is really helpful. And so when you're conducting this inventory, you're building a list of the different types of feedback you're collecting and what kind of tactics you're using to do that. It's really helpful to think about it in terms of three different layers. And this will help you kind of brainstorm about where might we be gathering feedback from customers. So if you look at the tactical layer, these are feedback on tactical things, right? On different touch points that you might have with a customer. So these could be things like an event. So for example, if Downtown UX had a survey after the presentation today, that would be a piece of voice of the customer data gathered at the tactical layer, getting feedback on one specific touch point, which is this event. At the journey layer, you're starting to gather feedback on more high priority milestones of the customer journey. And so if you think about the farmers, for example, one really important milestone for them was completing the application. So that becomes a journey layer metric. We're looking at something that actually is a milestone, kind of getting over a hurdle from start to finish in their journey with us as an organization. And so it's less about the kind of tactical interactions that they have. So for example, if there's a membership fee and you get something out of being a member of Downtown UX, just for an example, probably signing up for that membership and paying your first membership fee, that would be an example of a journey layer voice of the customer inventory point. So those two layers tend to be pretty transactional. And then there's that third relational level, which is the program layer. And that's really where you're looking more across the whole company or the whole program or the whole federal agency or whatever it is to really look at kind of organizational wide metrics and overall feedback. So these are more general questions that you would be asking and more general trends that you would track and feedback mechanisms. This might be something like a net promoter score, for example, when you're asking somebody, hey, would you buy from us again? Just a more general question. It's more about the relationship with the brand or with the company or organization than it is about a specific touch point or a specific tactic that they experience. So a really basic version of what that looks like is shown here, and this is a sample inventory from the National Cancer Institute, which is another client that I've worked with to do voice of the customer planning. And the National Cancer Institute has a program called the Small Business Innovation Research Program. And this is essentially a program where small businesses can apply to get government grants to help them develop cancer prevention, detection, or treatment technologies. So it's really about these inventors who have a technology who they think could help with treating cancer, and they apply to the National Cancer Institute to get a grant. They get to get funding, kind of seed funding to get started on that project and see if they can take it to market. So there's obviously a whole bunch of stuff that they have to do. They have to fill out the application to get that funding with the government, which is a really rigorous process that goes through a lot of reviews. And then once they become a grantee, there's a lot of interaction that they have to have with the government to make sure they're kind of doing what they were supposed to be doing with the grant money. And so there are a lot of different mechanisms that the National Cancer Institute uses to gather feedback from those grantees. So we had some in-depth interview transcripts, as you can see here. We actually had a dashboard of data about which companies got investor deals. So a lot of times these small businesses get money from the National Cancer Institute. That looks really appealing to investors, that they were kind of good enough with their idea to get funding from the federal government. So investors will come in and invest in them and help them get to market even faster. So we had data from that and feedback in terms of what they had reported to us about their investor deals. We had feedback forums for after events where we hosted events to help people either learn more about the application process, or if they're already a grantee, to help them learn more about how to get to market. And so you can see there are some of these more tactical layer things that we inventoried, like those post-event feedback forms, but there's also sometimes a crossover between layers. So if that event was around submitting the application, for example, that might also be a journey layer VOC inventory point, because it's something that's a milestone point in their journey. And so this is a really just basic example of what was the mechanism that we captured, a description of that mechanism and what it does and what layer we felt like it was in. And we were able to use a simple inventory like this to start thinking about where throughout the applicant or the grantee journey are we not collecting feedback? What milestones are there that we don't have any feedback on yet? It also helps us to look at things like, are we using the right feedback mechanism? Is a survey the right way to get feedback in the scenario that we're using it? And so this will help you kind of see where your blind spots are as an organization, where you perhaps could be gathering feedback that you're not currently, and where you might be able to adapt your feedback mechanisms to gather information in a more robust way, or perhaps even in a way that's less fatiguing for users and things like that. So this is just another example of kind of what this looks like at scale. So the sample inventory here is from the USDA, not the National Cancer Institute. And you can see here where we got really detailed with this one, and we actually were able to fill in a lot of more granular information to kind of help inform what we were doing across the organization here. So I'll stop just a minute and let you take a look at this. I know it's a little bit of an eye chart, and I'll grab a drink of water real quick. Okay, so we will move on then to step 2. So after you've taken that inventory, the next step is really to establish a baseline of where your current customer satisfaction ratings stand. You want to kind of look into customer contact behavior. So this is really about when you come into contact with a customer, if it's face-to-face contact, like the example here is a barista at a coffee shop, just as an example. Um, when those touch points happen, uh, what's happening there? Right? Are you collecting feedback on each of those customer contacts? What are some problems that might be experienced by customers if they're experiencing areas of poor performance or dissatisfaction in some of these areas? You also want to, as part of your baselining, establish any known pain points, right? So there may already be some hypotheses within the organization about, yeah, we know the experience is bad in this area or that area. Go ahead and capture those as part of your baselining, so that you can help to prioritize where you're going to improve, where you're going to start collecting more feedback and things like that along the way. And then you really want to look at your response effectiveness as another baseline metric. This would be, is the organization effectively responding to customers when customers make them aware about a problem or a concern that they have? How is that followed up on? How is it tracked? Have the outcomes been positive? Have you retained that user or that customer over time? So these are 4 really good kind of baseline metrics to start with. And so as you're inventorying the mechanisms that you're using, you may also start to look at some of these known pain points and response effectiveness areas and get ideas for where you could start collecting more feedback as well. You then want to outline your goals. And really, these first three steps can kind of happen in parallel. They don't necessarily have to be in chronological order, but it is really important to have some clearly defined goals around your VOC program. It seems like it's a no-brainer to say you need to know who your customer is, but after working a long time with federal government agencies, I can tell you they don't always know the answer to that question. And so really clearly defining who your customer is really important to make sure that you're first mapping out the right customer journey to inventory feedback mechanisms to make sure that you are looking at the right customer touch points and focusing in on the areas that are going to be most valuable for your organization. So you want to think about that customer and what their journey is and what the touch points along that journey look like so that you're really able to kind of map that to where you could be collecting feedback. You also want to talk with stakeholders internally about how are we going to use the feedback. It doesn't really do anything for you if you set up this VOC program and you get a lot of great feedback, but then you have no buy-in internally or no plan to actually use it to improve the user experience. And then finally, who's going to be responsible for taking action on that feedback? And that kind of goes along with the planning aspect of it. It really needs to be something that the whole organization is bought in on, and that there's really a clearly defined person or people who have roles and responsibilities to execute on improving the experience once you've collected the feedback. So to help you design your voice of the customer uh, surveys and collection mechanisms so that you're able to get to that point where you're actually getting actionable feedback. There are a few things that you can do. You want to ask first about the overall experience. That's a really important piece to pick up, and that'll give you some context about where the customer stands before they get into more detailed and kind of open-ended questions. And you really want to make sure that you're trying to avoid fatigue when you're doing this. So you want to keep it pretty short when you're collecting feedback. You want to make sure you prioritize the most important questions first in case you don't get somebody to complete your full survey. And you want to make sure that you test your feedback mechanisms with users before you deploy them at scale. So I mentioned the survey fatigue piece. That's a really big part of this. There, of course, are many ways that you'll collect feedback, but short surveys are going to be one of the most important ways. And you want to make sure that you keep that at 5 questions or fewer if you possibly can. And if you're spreading out your feedback collection across multiple touch points, they don't need to be a big long survey. You're not asking about the whole entire customer experience from start to finish. You're really only asking about one touch point at a time and getting feedback for how you can improve the user experience with some of those more micro transaction or micro moment type experiences. And so you can keep these really short, give them a really small number of rating options, and you want to limit the number of surveys that you send to them to about every 3 months. You can always remind them once if they don't take the survey, but try not to pester them too often. So then once you have your goal set, you have a plan for how you're going to act on the feedback that you get, you go out and you design your collection instruments and you have all this great feedback. You're going to then have to synthesize all of that research data as you do with any other user research or usability study. And then you're going to have to triage it into actual changes. So in designing products, a lot of time that looks like adding something to the backlog, right? Where we're going to go in and we're going to make some changes in the next sprint because of what we found in the usability testing. In this case, when you're doing triage, there's a lot of different things that could happen. It's really helpful to develop a coding scheme to help document what categories all of the feedback that you collect fall into. And so with the National Cancer Institute, for example, uh, we use these sample coding schemes of things like the challenges that the grantees were facing, or what their motivation was to apply for funding in the first place. And this helped us to categorize feedback, and then it helped us to have it grouped in ways that we could hand it off for action with the relevant folks. So, for example, when we're talking about the motivation to apply, there was this kind of viewpoint that because the application process was so onerous, that the National Cancer Institute was sort of a last resort for funding for these small biotech companies who were developing new cancer treatment products. And so the motivation was kind of low in a lot of cases because of that. So that was really something that we were able to hand off to folks who were involved in the application process to try to make that process more streamlined. It was information that we were able to hand off to the marketing teams and public affairs teams within the organization so that they could message that it wasn't really as bad as you think filling out the application to get a government grant, and so that we could develop more plain language products to help guide people through the process. On the other hand, when we got feedback about program appreciation, for example, that was stuff that we were able to hand off to HR and to program directors to really understand what was causing delightful moments in the applicant experience and in the grantee experience, a lot of which stemmed from really great interactions with program directors and program managers who they were working with and getting mentored by at the National Cancer Institute. And so having a coding mechanism, even if it's a simple one, it could be like this one below where it's just people, process, program, or touch point related feedback. Having some sort of coding scheme, and you can develop it internally kind of based on your own needs, but it really helps you to categorize the feedback and synthesize it a little more easily, and then decide which groups to hand it off internally to triage. And so in a lot of cases, there's a lot of this work that might go to the UX team, but in other cases, there's some of this work that might go to a team that manages a call center, for example. And so it really just kind of depends. So part of that triaging process is then to start a backlog of improvements that you can start to act upon. And this is really the most important part. A lot of organizations collect customer feedback data and then they don't really do anything with it. A study from Temkin, who does a lot of customer experience research and puts out a lot of great studies on this, they found that only 24% of companies are actually developing action plans and implementing changes in the organization based on the feedback they get. And so often, it's the job of somebody inside the organization to do surveys, to gather feedback, to do customer research or market research, but it's the job of somebody in another department to do some of the implementation piece. A lot of that data never even makes it over to the IT and the UX teams. And so this is really about putting a more formal approach around how we collect feedback, how we share it among the organization, and how we then act upon it. Because the actually taking the pain points that our customers are having and building them into a backlog of improvements is the most important piece. Without that, you're really just collecting data for to sit there and collect dust. But in this way, you're taking this data that you're collecting and you're using it to actually inform our designs and make them better for whatever services or products we're designing. And then finally, you also want to make sure that you're closing the loop with your customers. And so if you want to develop a voice of the customer program that is continuous and where you're always collecting uh, actionable feedback from your customers, it's really helpful if you acknowledge to them that you received their feedback, that you share what changed based on their feedback, and kind of involve them in the process of making some of the fixes. And so this helps the customers feel like they really have some ownership in the brand, and it makes them more likely to keep participating in your voice of the customer programs down the road, so that you don't get into that kind of survey fatigue, so that people don't say, oh, you know what, I provided feedback, but nothing ever changes there. It's really great to close the loop with them, and give the customer a little bit more insight and have a little bit more transparency about how you're improving things for them over time. So then lastly, I'm just going to talk quickly about, okay, you now know what this is, why it's important, and how you do it. How do you start small and kind of scale up over time is the question that I get a lot at this point in the talk. And so what that looks like is really that there are different stages of maturity for voice of the customer, and uh, it's not necessarily four stages for everyone, but this is pretty typical of what I've seen in the past, is that organizations start out with kind of figuring out the basics, doing some of the initial things. Then they move on to having different feedback mechanisms. They have some of their goals and technology in place to be able to collect feedback. And then as they grow in maturity, they start to do things like procure enterprise tools for customer experience. They start to tie these feedback mechanisms into other systems, either CRM tools or other ways of tracking how these things are impacting the customers. And then in the advanced stage, you're really seeing what's a program that covers each touch point of the customer journey, where customers are really involved in collaborating in the solutioning process for products and services. And you see more collaboration across all functions in the organization, so that feedback data isn't siloed. It's actually able to be used and shared internally. So some places where we've seen this in action actually is with Uber. Uber is a really great example of this, where you can see this nice feedback form that they have here is really easy and simple, and this is a pretty mature development voice of the customer, where this survey is actually feeding directly into a dashboard that helps designers and engineers decide what bug fixes and different improvements to the UI to implement next to improve the experience. So as you start to mature and you start to scale up, you won't be doing the Uber thing necessarily on day one, but there are kind of three key things here that you can keep in mind. So it is a lot easier to implement a program like this if you have an enterprise survey solution, especially if it has some nice textual analysis capabilities. So these would be things like Qualtrics, those sorts of tools. But you could even be doing this with really simple free survey software when you're first starting out. A CRM solution that integrates with your surveys is even better, and that's kind of scaling up the maturity model a little bit. But as you see, Oracle and Salesforce have some products that are starting to do this. There's some of the bigger customer experience suites like Medallia who are doing this kind of work. But you start to be able to collect that feedback and then quickly connect it to customers and to teams who are working to support that customer's experience. And then it's really helpful to use some collaborative project management tools so that you can track the action planning, and so that you can track your backlog of improvements and make sure they're actually getting implemented. And this can be really simple. This can be something like a Trello board or Microsoft Planner or whatever you already use at your organization. One of the key things is that as organizations start to scale up, sometimes they don't maintain their momentum. You really want to focus in on making a steady stream of improvements over time. So again, having somebody who's in charge of driving that action planning and prioritizing issues the same way you would do with backlog grooming for a product. You want to make sure that you're really bringing the full organization together to act on the feedback you're getting, that it's not just data that you collect and report out on, but it's data that you actually contextualize and act on. And then you also want to make sure that you're getting enough stakeholder buy-in to secure resources you need to make these improvements. So obviously, you're going to get all this great feedback. You're going to want to make a bunch of changes about it, but somebody's got to fund that inside the organization. And so stakeholder buy-in early and often is great at driving that. And typically, I found that a lot of internal stakeholders quickly see the value in doing this because of some of that stuff that we talked about earlier, knowing how much customer experience impacts the bottom line. As you're scaling up and growing the team, it's really dependent on your own organization and kind of your internal strengths and capabilities, how you build your voice of the customer team. I found that this model works really well to have a delivery manager who's doing a lot of that day-to-day, keeping the backlog on track and making sure that there's action planning happening, getting stakeholder buy-in and keeping everybody on time and on budget. So that's great to have that delivery manager role. And then you want a CX lead who's skilled at service design, and who understands how voice of the customer plugs in to the overall customer experience. This is probably someone who's familiar with journey mapping, and who's familiar with those sorts of CX deliverables and can help you see the big picture of how do we take this feedback that we're getting and map it to different touch points along the customer journey. And then research is a big part of this. So you need somebody who's a research lead who's really skilled at gathering both qualitative and quantitative data, and who can build surveys that are going to get you valid results over time. And you need researchers who can go out and implement some of those plans as well. It's really great if those researchers are IAs or they're UX researchers, because they can understand then when there's an interaction with a heuristics type touch point or some kind of potential usability issue that's causing the customer pain point, they can highlight those things a lot better than somebody who doesn't have that kind of background can do. And it's always helpful if you have a visual designer or a graphic designer on board who can kind of help you visualize all this as you go along the way. It's not really a requirement, but I found that it's a lot easier to get the stakeholder buy-in if you have somebody who can help to visualize the process and kind of create either a journey map or some other kind of visual asset along the way. So to close, this is kind of what the VOC cycle looks like. It's really about that initial baselining and inventorying so that you're planning around how you're going to develop your voice of the customer program. You've determined what the important customer touch points are. You've determined whether or not you're gathering feedback at those points or not, and where you could be improving. And then you're gonna use those different mechanisms that we talked about, surveys, interviews, etc., to really listen to what customers are saying, to then synthesize and triage so you can learn from those things, and then build an action plan, and then of course make sure that you communicate back to those customers to close the loop. And then any lessons that you learn, you can wrap into the next cycle, because this isn't a one and done kind of thing. It's a really systematic, continuous process that you do over time. And with that, that closes the presentation. Thanks for your time. It was really great to be able to present this with all of you. I appreciate you attending. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them at this time.